This is exactly what we do in all the labs. As I said, we factorize the code for the tests, and what I want you to understand over time is how the test environment is interacting with your own code. Good. Then in the questions.c, let's take the questions one by one and see what we are asked to do. So the main change from lab 0 into lab 1, everything would be exactly the same for the environment. The main thing is now you'll start developing somehow a more real code that implements what you guys covered in lectures, right? For example, the first question is touching multiple loop types like for, while, do, while, which we did in lecture 3. And then the second one is doing some if conditioning. So you would check if a certain input is 5-digit or not through conditions. The third one is again doing something you can do, use conditions or switch case, which is you take an average of a student, and based on the value you would see what is his GPA. For example, it's between 90 and 100, you get 4, etc., etc., etc. So you have multiple if else cases, or you have multiple switch cases. Both are okay. Okay, so the question, what I'm doing right now is just going quickly through the questions one by one and see if I should stop at any one of them if it requires some kind of background. So in the fourth question, it kind of covers a little bit of math because it will ask you to, so you know that pi is an infinite number, like it's 3.14 something 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 something, so it can go infinitely, right? Because it's not a closing fraction, and there is a series that is approximating pi based on how many terms you take, and this series is given in the lab 1 document. Let me, I guess I have this open here. Okay, so this is might be something good to here, this question 4. So the pi series can be calculated as these terms, like the first term, second term, third term. And then the main purpose of this function, what you are asked to do is take an input, it's an integer input, it tells you how many parameters or how many terms you should consider in this series. For example, if your input is only 1, that means your pi will be 4. For sure that's incorrect, right? But and a very bad approximation. This is why no one should take only a single term in this series, but this is a valid input, right? If you are asked to take 2, then your pi should be 4 minus 4 over 3, right? And then you return double, which is the value of pi. So if you go back to the lab, you will see that you are reading this. I already gave you the definition of pi as a double. You are asked to calculate this series, write the code that implements this series. I should be able to draw here. So your main purpose of this function is, or your main role in this function is to implement this series based on the value you take as an input and then return pi. Good? Okay. So some more math in question 5. So basically what you are asked to do is you are asked to find all the Pythagorean triples of a triangle within a certain range. Here is 400. So that means you are given this number as a fixed number. This is why the function doesn't take any input. Question 5 here doesn't take any input. And so let me ask you a question. If the function doesn't take any input, how many test cases we can generate for this function? What do you think? Let me see the chat here. Only one, correct, because test cases are only stimulating the input to a function, trying to stimulate different branch, would say, or different scenario of the function based on the input you provide. If there are no inputs at all, that means just a single test, right? So you stop at 400. Any Pythagorean triples of any triangle from 1, but there is no 1 basically, like 1 to 400, then you should report these, right? What you are asked to do, you are returning an int, right? So what you are asked to do is to count these. So if I go back to the lab, you will see here, you are given, can I write here? No, I can write only in Bing. Okay, so you are given the definition of the total number of triples, which you will be returning, right? And then here I'm giving you some hints on what you should do. So I'm saying you should use, for example, some treble nested for loop to calculate these things. And then each time you detect there is a Pythagorean treble, you increase your count, which is your total number of trebles. At the end, you return this. As far as this goes, that's great. There is only one extra step that you need to do, which is once you found a treble, you are also supposed to print an if statement that says, oh, I found a treble, side 1, side 2, side 3, etc. Right? Just to show you, like you will see in your console that what trebles did you find, right? Is that clear? Is there any question? A main purpose of the tutorial is try to clarify if there is anything of background that you need to know about the lab. So if you have questions, ask, right? Okay,
so
good. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Nicole.
To take in this lab into our Eclipse, we do the same like import we did for Lab 0.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, this is something that is also good to confirm again, is what we have done in Lab 0 was a more of an exercise of what we should do in all labs. You have done it once, you went through all the hard times to make sure you are familiar with, but afterwards everything should be exactly like a couple of minutes, right? You import your project, you have it, you create an Eclipse project into the same folder that you have your repo in, and then you start development. So it's exactly the same step at the beginning, and also the same steps at the end. Once you finish development, or once, let me say, that's a wrong statement. Once you finish development for the setting you are in, you commit and push, right? The changes you make. Thank you.
Sorry, can we already put the Lab1 from GitHub already?
Yeah, Lab1 is already there. It's starting next Monday. I have put it already 2 days ago. And the lab document is in Avenue. Similar to Lab 0 in the lab PDF here, you have an invitation link that you have an invitation link here that you click, exactly similar to Lab 0, that you just accept the invitation. It will create the repo for you in your GitHub account. You go through the same process. Good?
Thanks.
Thank you. And Lab 1 is starting this coming Monday, and it takes 2 weeks, right? And the deadline is already written in the lab document that we have open right now. Okay, let me go back to the lab and continue with the remaining questions. Question 6, count is this should be the variable that should hold the total number of found perfect numbers. Okay, perfect numbers, another math thing. So you are given, so question 6 is question 6 is the name of the function. It takes 2 inputs. And this would require you to understand, again, last lecture. So the first one is an int, and it's like dictating what is the range you need to stop at to find the perfect numbers, right? And then int perfect here is an array that we use to hold all the perfect numbers you find, right? And then int at the end is returning the count of this perfect number you found. For example, let me give you one example that we have in the document to illustrate what we mean by this. So here, assume, for example, that I provided for question 6, the question 6 input is 10, right? If you go from 1 to 10, the only perfect number you find is 6. What is a perfect number from math? Is the number that its factors sum up to the same number, right? So 6 is 2 by 3 by 1, and then if you add 2 and 3 and 1 gives you 6. So this is a perfect number, right? So if I give you your range as 10, and you start from 1 trying to find your perfect numbers, in fact, you should start from 2 because 1 is not a perfect number. But anyway, if you start from 1 to 10, you only find a single perfect number, which is 6. That means your count here, your return value should be, so here, if I'm providing this as 10, this one should hold the count, which means I only found 1. And your perfect array should hold only a single value, which is 6, right? So what is written here is perfect 0 should be 6, while the count should return 1, right? If I went to like 100, for example, you would find some more perfect numbers, I guess 6 and then 28, if I remember correctly. And then perfect 0 should be 6, which is the first perfect number you find. Perfect 1 is the second perfect number you found. perfect 3 is the third one, etc., etc., etc. Good. So that means this function, and this is a question that I have to you. That means this function is modifying this array, right? But this array is passed as an input. So how this is possible? Shouldn't I, for example, add this and thing here to allow the function? Remember, we did the scanf that we sent the address as well to allow the function to modify the input. Is there any hint about this? Do you remember this from the lecture of arrays? That we said arrays are passed by default, what we call passed by reference to the function, which means the function will be able to modify by default, right? Because the array name is in fact an address, as we will see later when we talk about pointers. The array name, which is perfect here, it's the address of the first element, right? So you are passing an address by default once you pass an array. Another thing that is important to touch in this question, we said in the last lecture, is sometimes you want to return many values, right? For example, in this function, if you found 5 perfect numbers, functions in C only return a single value, right? Here, it's a way to return multiple values by passing an array to the input and modify this array. This will allow you to return how many perfect numbers you found, like 5, 6, 7. It's a variable number, right? So again, it's another trick that you can deal with functions to allow them to modify and return multiple values at once. Good. And then, don't we need to define the size of the array? No. I guess, okay, that's a good question. So this takes us back to the local versus global variables, and we will continue this topic in the coming lecture. But input parameters to the function. So here we have this as empty, right? It's a placeholder that is telling you are passing an array to this function, right? Maybe it's good to touch on this, but for this I need my notes. So okay, because that's in fact a very excellent question. So let's go back to the function that we had. I know it was question 6 if I remember correctly. It has an int. Let's say the question 6 input, and then it has this int perfect. Then take this as an empty. So this question is saying, here I'm defining an array without a size, but we said in the array lecture that you have to statically define the size of the array in C, right? That's because this array, you don't define it here, right? We said it's passed by variable. So remember from last lecture, the calling function. For example, in our case, we are going to call question 6 in the test cases, right? So I'm going to call question 6, passing some input value, like 10, for example, and passing a certain array, right? This array is, I call it my, I don't know, anything, my perfect. I guess you find it called in the test cases actual, right? It's called actual array, but it doesn't really matter. You just pass it as this. So when you do this, this is function calling, right? Remember from our last lecture, this is function calling. And this is function prototyping, and hopefully we also have the definition in the .c file. When I call a function, what we said last time is the parameters are passed one by one to the input parameters of the function prototype. So the 10 will be placed in question 6 underscore input. That means question 6 underscore input is a variable if this is the memory space of the question 6 function. There is a variable here that is int, and it's called question 6 underscore input. That is going to take the value 10 once I call it, right? On the other hand, this perfect array will not be in this memory space, because I told you arrays are passed by reference, which means you only hold the address. So this array, if this is my question, assume I'm calling question 6 in the main. So here I have my main, and okay, so I have my main and I'm calling question 6 here. So before calling question 6, I have to define this array, which is my perfect. And then it's defined as 100 in the test cases, and this is an int array. And then you call question 6 as 10 and then pass my perfect. That means in this memory space, I have already defined my perfect array, right? Correct? Okay, and then now what I'm doing is just passing a reference to question 6 about this array. So if question 6 function is modifying the array, it will in fact modify directly this array in whoever called in the caller function, right? This is why you don't need to define your perfect array inside the question 6. It's already defined. If you open test cases .c, I keep switching here, but I guess hope this is useful. So if we go into here, and then if we go into the test cases, here you find that we already define it's expected. So we define an array of 100 elements here. So we specify the type, and then we pass, this is how we call question 6 function. You pass an end value which is input, here it's 5, and then you pass the actual array, which is also 100, right? So you already define it in the caller function. You don't define it in the callee or the question 6 function itself. I hope this clarifies things, and this is very important to understand. Can you only do pass by reference with array? This is what I'm saying, is that arrays are passed by reference by default. You don't need the and. You just give the name of the array, like what we do here, right? I'm just sending actual, right? Which is the array that I defined here. And this function question 6, in fact, is going to modify the actual array without needing to do anything extra, right? Pointers to variables are passed by reference. Let's not talk about pointers for now. This is an advanced topic. So I appreciate that some of you are already familiar with programming, but I don't want to confuse the remaining ones. But thanks, Mark, for your note. Is there any other question related to this? So this is important to understand. So to summarize, what is the summary? The summary is any variable, like what we said in last lecture, any variable that is passed to a function, another copy in the memory of this variable is created. So whatever the function is changing will not reflect in the change of the original caller. And we gave the example in the previous lecture about x and y and a and b. But for arrays, it's a special case. If you pass an array and you modify the array inside the function, the change will reflect in the caller function. And this is exactly what's happening here. This is a function that is calling question 6, passing an array into it, which is actual. Actual is being changed in the question 6 function to add the perfect numbers you find. And here, when you try to print actual to compare it with the expected, it will hold the values that question 6 pushed into it. Hopefully that's clear now.